one of the first natural wonders of the Orion Arm, was discovered early in the interstellar age. As the frontiers expanded outwards, what appeared from Earth to be a smudge of rust on the edge of the local supercluster was revealed instead to be broad coiling ribbons of gas and dust, churning tendrils of burnt orange and dusky gold in which the remnants of dying stars pulsed dully. Even amidst the drama of the space race, the first broadcasts of these curling waves of cosmic flame briefly united humanity in awe and wonder. Today, this phenomenon is named the Well of Embers. Yet in contrast to the space around it, brimming with lush and verdant worlds perfectly suited for human life, the Well of Embers is eerily desolate. Its few planetary systems orbit swollen, ancient stars, their worlds either frozen husks of ice and rock or searing, barren wastelands. A surreal beauty exists here. Skies that bleed with a dark and fiery amber, landscapes shrouded under the weight of ancient light. Kuralu is one such world, located deep in the center of the well. Cracked salt flats and sandy basins form sweeping mosaics that mark the arid plains of its continents, their jagged patterns stretching outwards for hundreds of miles. Scorched and raw volcanic crags break the monotony, alongside receding, shallow seas and thin, smoking rivers. They shimmer with emerald hues, belying their toxic nature. Above, thick, suffocating clouds of dust and ash ring the planet, immense storms that howl endlessly across the desolation. There would be few reasons for any soul to travel here, were it not for the presence of the boreholes. Each is a scar on the natural landscape, gaping wide like an infected wound. Thousands are believed to have been carved deep into the planet's crust, and of those so far discovered, even the smallest is more than 1 kilometer wide at its opening. They have provoked speculation and theory. But while the scientific community remains divided on their purpose, there is no shred of doubt as to their origins. The uniformity and perfection of the boreholes bears the unmistakable mark of intentional design. And just a few hundred feet within, clinging to their sides, ring after ring of structures have been built. They are clearly abandoned, old and brittle, occasionally crumbling away into the depths below. But further down, these give way to far more enduring structures, tunnels that snake their way effortlessly through solid rock, great halls the size of football stadiums. They form complexes that flow outwards from the boreholes like subterranean rivers, twisting unpredictably through the earth and occasionally converging with the deeper levels below. And in sections of this labyrinth, in chambers uncovered far within, are murals depicting hundreds of inhuman shapes writhing in unnatural poses, marked by symbols that defy any known language or logic. The boreholes are alien. But the final, definitive proof arrived, for those who still demanded it, when explorers entered their lowest levels for the first time. And here, they found the remains. First thousands, then tens of thousands. Skeletal things, white and chalky, brittle to the touch. They line the corridors and fill the great halls. Piles nearly reaching to their ceilings, and in the vast natural caverns at the bottom of each hole, so many have been piled so high and so far that under the glare of searchlights, their shattered forms resemble new-fallen snow, bright and pristine, blanketing the landscape far into the distance. But amongst all the boreholes and the charnel pits, one alone has been uniquely marked. The heart of Kuralu's tragedy lies here, a place that the first explorers to see it could only describe as the gateway to hell. The Kuralu civilization, named for the world on which their remains were discovered, is definitively extraterrestrial in origin. At the time of their discovery, verified alien ruins within the Well of Embers were not a shock to humanity, extraterrestrial life having been present on Earth since the early 1930s. But their discovery relatively early in the space race, at a time when the existential danger posed by the Synfaxi remained so immediate, provoked an international investigation under the League of Nations. When investigators and researchers confirmed that the Kuralu civilization was thoroughly extinct, and without any connection to the invasive life forms spreading in the Synfaxi quarantine zones, further exploration of the ruins was suspended. It is only in recent decades that academic interest in this alien race has been rekindled. In that time, significant discoveries have been made. We know that in many ways the Kuralu were like us, carbon-based, dependent on oxygen, nutrients, and water. They cared for their young, worked together in communities, could manipulate objects and tools, and even express themselves through art. They were self-aware, experienced physical pain, and understood the concept of mortality. We know they were an advanced civilization. They modified their bodies with technology, created new methods of reproduction, and engineered machines of stunning complexity. They were spacefaring, settling worlds and traveling throughout the stars. And despite their intelligence and power, we know that it was not enough. The boreholes they left behind tell a story of decay, collapse, and extinction. The Kuralu are often described as a cross between Terran termites and crustaceans. Roughly the size of a human adolescent, they moved on 6 pairs of legs, some of which ended in claws, most notably the larger front pair, which could be manipulated as both tools and weapons. Secondary appendages, numbering anywhere from 8 to 23, were distributed along the 4 major segments of their bodies. These grasping limbs provided both a tactile sense of the environment and precise motor control required for complex tasks. Their antennae, covered in delicate sensory bristles, were capable of sensing minute changes in the air and detecting vibrations imperceptible to humans. An exoskeleton covered their entire body, composed of a segmented chitinous material. Originally of burnished copper and slate hue, each was adorned with intricate natural ridges and lines, believed to serve as markers of status. Damage, wear, and modifications found on these exoskeletons reveal hints of an individual's status, role, and life. Kuralu's senses were superior to those of humans in some circumstances, but they perceived sounds, smells, and touch in dramatically different ways. Their compound eyes provided a wide field of view, capable of detecting movement from all directions and excelling in low-light environments. While they were unable to perceive certain wavelengths visible to the human eye, they could detect others beyond these same limits. One of the most debated aspects of the species is whether individual members possessed autonomy or were driven by some sort of gestalt consciousness. There is evidence to support either argument, but the common appearance of paintings, statues, and reliefs carved into the walls of ceremonial chambers seems to indicate at least some emphasis on personal identity and the social transmission of knowledge. Variants in the biology of Kuralu remains suggest their species exhibited some kind of hierarchical, caste-based structure. Thousands of strains of Kuralu have been identified that can be grouped together into larger families. Often, the distinctions are subtle, and so the hundreds of families are typically grouped into 5 overarching castes: labor, soldier, scholar, priest, and reproductive. Though these terms evoke human interpretations of each role, their expression among the kuralu was more complex. Each caste fulfilled a wide-ranging spectrum of functions that, by human standards, would seem paradoxical or illogical. Soldiers, for example, were closely associated with the reproductive caste, while the role of priests and scholars can appear entirely arbitrary. Even the labor caste, which resembled most closely the human understanding of the term, incorporated strains engineered to perform mundane, repetitive tasks, alongside biological computers specialized towards complex problem-solving and logic. Within a single caste, extreme differences existed in physical ability and intellectual acuity. The nature of the caste system is further complicated by the fact that large aspects of its structure were artificially imposed and manipulated by the kuralu themselves. While some sort of hierarchical framework must have existed naturally within their species, it evolved over generations as their society advanced until cultural shifts, genetic engineering, and cybernetics overtook and accelerated this change. The absence of any underlying morality, as humanity understands the concept, makes this system appear especially cruel and alien. Though preliminary studies in this area remain divisive, it is widely speculated that many of the mechanical augmentations among the kuralu race were extremely painful, either due to design flaws or as a deliberate means of control. Some strains were unable to survive in a natural state. An implant common across certain strains of the labor caste was often poorly grafted to their exoskeletons, whose remains show signs of chipping and splintering that would have punctured internal structures. The replacement of limbs and organs with mechanical tools or weapons was permanent, deeply embedded so as to make any removal extremely destructive to the body. Some strains of soldier may have only been able to function for a few years or months before they physically began to split apart under the strain of the weaponry that had been surgically attached to their bodies. The suffering of some strains is beyond description. Large numbers of the reproductive caste were genetically manipulated beyond recognition, their bodies grotesquely engorged to better fit within labyrinthine machinery. In what are believed to be mechanical birthing chambers, these creatures functioned more like biological components than autonomous beings. Thousands were secured in place by piercing hooks and biosynthetic cables, arranged side by side, column by column, operated on like parts in an assembly line. The kuralu are not believed to have had a government in the traditional sense, nor a queen, as their vaguely insectoid appearance might suggest. Leading theories instead propose that within each caste, a distinct strain emerged, one born in 10 million with heightened instincts and awareness. These individuals served as community leaders, or quartermasters, naturally dominating a significant portion of their caste as they matured. The quartermasters collectively guided kuralu civilization through methods of mass communication and control that remain only partially understood. In their optimal state, the castes do not appear to have been in conflict or rivals. The divisions between them were permeable, with large fluctuations in both their composition and share of the total population. When confronted with a major societal crisis or opportunity, hundreds of millions of individuals could transition from one strain or caste to another. Through artificially assisted metamorphosis, they emerged fully adapted to their new roles, equipped with both biological and mechanical enhancements. From a human perspective, the kuralu appear to have operated in a state of perpetual total mobilization, seamlessly shifting between militaristic, expansionist, economic, or scientific pursuits as circumstances demanded. Where human societies might take months or years to make such transitions, the kuralu could react instantly, described in one study as akin to a machine shifting gears. Nearly all of what we understand about the kuralu comes from studying the hundreds of enormous cylindrical shafts that have been carved deep into the planetary crust of their world. Though their dimensions can vary significantly, 19 unique architectural standards of borehole have been cataloged to date. Their openings to the surface, on average, exceed 2 kilometers in diameter, large enough to completely envelop the hull of a mid-range interstellar liner. Thousands of descending levels have been carved around the hollow core of each borehole, with tunnels in their walls providing access to the larger chambers and labyrinth of spaces that surround each shaft. These sprawling tunnel networks link together the Kutagalu equivalent of residential areas, industrial zones, and cultural places, all of which were located entirely underground. They sprawled outward for kilometers around each borehole, some with chambers comparable in size to modern stadiums and performance venues. The total depth is often difficult to determine. Many boreholes empty into vast natural caverns deep below the surface or have partially collapsed. Certain boreholes have been found to descend as deep as 20 kilometers, far exceeding anything achieved by human engineering. Only the barest traces of archaeological evidence have been uncovered on the surface of the planet itself. The remains of massive arms or cranes are commonly found, multiples of which would have once spanned outwards over the opening of each borehole, aligned like spokes around a great wheel. It is believed these structures once hoisted immense sails of fabric over the borehole openings, potentially as a means to regulate temperatures or to harness the native winds. Yet, just a few hundred meters beyond the entrance of each shaft, all signs of activity and use vanish entirely. The Kutagalu seem to have been entirely subterranean, with direct contact with each borehole limited or non-existent. Consequently, some studies contend that the boreholes may not have been the equivalent of colonies or cities as it is often speculated, but perhaps a prison or fortress. There is ample evidence that the Kutagalu were not native to their eponymous world. Of the primitive flora and fauna local to the planet, none share more than a loose, coincidental genetic similarity with the remains found in the boreholes. Moreover, the boreholes themselves are no more than a few thousand years old, carved into the planet within a relatively short period, perhaps even simultaneously. Yet the mystery of how an alien species arrived in this more remote part of the Orion Arm is equaled by the circumstances surrounding their sudden extinction. Perhaps most intriguing, the Kutagalu seemed eager to explain. Paintings, sculptures, and especially relief carvings are prominent throughout their ruins. They appear meaningless, but unsettling to human senses. Yet many of the most advanced xenolinguistic models have produced strikingly similar interpretations. At a distant point in their history, the first communities of Kutagalu emerged on their homeworld. They progressed through a series of ages, some loosely analogous to humanity's agricultural and industrial revolutions, alongside other events and cultural shifts that remain difficult to categorize. One of the latter may have been the advent of interstellar travel. Frequent references point to a transformation or rebirth that seems to have coincided with a golden age in their development and expansion. How and why the Kutagalu settled in the Well of Embers is beyond the capabilities of modern models to assess, but almost certainly occurred towards the end of this same era. Yet within 1 or 2 centuries of their arrival, believed to have occurred between 600 and 2,000 years ago, the Kutagalu in the Well of Embers experienced a gradual decline, followed by a sudden collapse. Their remains show a degradation in both the sophistication and ubiquity of their cybernetics, alongside systemic evidence of violence. Even the manner in which the Kutagalu disposed of their remains suggests a society that unraveled amidst disorder and desperation. The extinction of the Kutagalu seems to have begun with a series of confused and rapid societal reorganizations across its castes. Large segments of the population were repeatedly cycled through different strains, undergoing a near constant metamorphosis that left their bodies deformed, or unable to survive the process. Hundreds of thousands, likely millions of kuralu died during this time, their bodies housed in special chambers that can still be found throughout their labyrinths. Some speculate that this upheaval was driven by a dwindling number of quartermaster strains among the castes, either an attempt to create more or a symptom of their absence. The widespread failure of their birthing chambers, along with other critical technologies essential to this process, appears to have followed soon after. Their society had entered into an irreversible collapse. In the aftermath, a behavioral sink manifested within the kuralu, assessed by most researchers as having occurred in 3 phases. In the first, Stage A, a new social order violently emerged as the greater caste system broke apart. Exoskeletons recovered from these generations show a near absence of cybernetics or genetic modification, but extensive physical harm, fractures, deep lacerations, and evidence of increasingly crude repairs. Upon death, proper disposal was abandoned, and bodies were instead dropped down the hollow core of each borehole, eventually forming great piles within the natural caverns beneath them. Concurrently, the highest levels of each labyrinth, those closest to the surface, were entirely abandoned, and the survivors restricted their activities to a few dozen comparatively tiny sections deeper down. Within these areas, hundreds of thousands of kuralu filled even the largest tunnels and chambers so tightly that movement must have been almost impossible. They had been reduced to great clumps of living masses, savage, animalistic colonies surrounded by miles of their abandoned, dilapidated structures. In Stage B, the behavior of each caste seems to have become even more erratic and self-destructive. The societal delineations between the soldier and labor castes disappeared, and both fell into extreme lethargy. Their inactivity was so severe that their bodies began to degrade, remaining motionless even when assaulted or fed upon by others. Occasionally, however, episodes of extreme violence erupted within their ranks. Sudden outbreaks of psychotic behavior that spread rapidly through their populations. Certain strains of the reproductive caste, meanwhile, those capable of still moving independently and producing offspring, withdrew even deeper into the boreholes. They were attended to by what remained of the priests, who, in turn, were driven to exhaustion under the extreme stress of trying to protect these new lairs at all times. Rump communities centered around fertile kuralu typically existed on the edges of the main host. They were ignored for the most part, but occasionally attacked rivals within their former caste, presumably seeking better nesting sites. In contrast to the others, bodies of the scholar caste are nearly always found in small groups, or alone in the more remote parts of the boreholes. Many have been found in what were once the most advanced sections of the labyrinths, coiling up to die beneath vast machines that likely never functioned in their lifetimes. This may have been instinctual. Generations of remains have been found in clusters around the same machines, and incredibly for the kuralu, a few from this caste have even been located on the surface. All were found in recessed areas of the crane structures that once spanned the borehole's openings, providing shade and shelter to those below. Few of the scholar caste survived this stage, and it was likely the first to become extinct. In Phase C, the psychotic violence that had permeated through the kuralu became total. During this period, their food sources, which had likely been automated, began to fail, triggering a mass die-off within the isolated clumps of kuralu colonies. The survivors were forced to relocate, but appeared to have grown so dependent on constant, overwhelming social clustering that they could only move together in dense, chaotic masses. These immense living colonies, made up of tens of thousands of kuralu, would have been forced through tunnels almost like a clog in a pipe, the crushed remains of individuals discovered jammed into even the most confining and inaccessible crevices. When these roaming masses encountered one another or contested the same section of the labyrinth, extreme violence ensued, with the victors engaging in widespread cannibalism of the defeated. In some instances, however, especially when these masses managed to break into chambers housing groupings of the reproductive strains, the carnage did not stop with victory. The young, often still within their larvae, were consumed, and the survivors then turned on one another, continuing the slaughter until nothing was left alive. Within the reproductive strains, displaced aggression from these constant attacks was increasingly directed toward their own young. Newborn kuralu were driven from the nests into labyrinths before they had fully matured, leaving them unlikely to survive in any of the remaining masses. As competition and desperation within the boreholes intensified, Phase C could only culminate in extinction. During the early colonization effort, the first expedition to reach the deeper levels of a borehole discovered a chamber of clearly alien remains, half submerged in a lake of what appeared to be human blood. The liquid was later identified as water, heavily contaminated by iron oxide runoff and bacteria. But the initial shock of the discovery had left a mark on the scientific community, and the kuralu are today the second most studied species in xenoarchaeology. During the more accommodating summer months, roughly 15,000 people from over 200 nations reside in research stations across the planet. The work of these scientists, engineers, and support staff spans multiple fields, with some of the most informative and compelling publications spanning xenology, planetary science, and astrosociology, all driven by discoveries made on kuralu. Some of these stations and outposts, particularly those constructed on the edges of the boreholes, have reported strange occurrences. Recording equipment and sensors placed in the deeper levels are occasionally damaged or disappear without apparent cause. In these same locations, strange vibrations have been detected, and what is believed to be a biological sound resembling sizzling grease has been recorded more than 24 times. In a well-known incident, a civilian research vessel carrying 300 passengers, accompanied by 2 Genoese patrol craft, detected movement while at a stationary hover 6 kilometers beneath the surface, deep within the core of borehole 092. The activity was obstructed and not observed directly, but recorded for 97 seconds across a broad spectrum of sensors. Many scientific organizations now speculate that life forms may be present in some of the deeper boreholes of the planet. They stop short of naming these the kuralu themselves. Kuralu is a world of mysteries and secrets, but comfort lies in its consistency. If you've seen one borehole, as those who study them are prone to say, you've seen them all. Which is why the most alarming discovery ever made on kuralu was the one that broke its own rules. In 2279, 6 years before the time of this recording, a Royal Marines patrol craft discovered 31 people clinging to life, wandering through the wastelands. The crew of a smuggling vessel that had crashed on the planet weeks earlier. But it was not their miraculous survival that made waves across the Orion Arm, but the footage they had brought back with them. In their journey to find rescue, the survivors had encountered something out in the northern wastes. They had named it the Gateway to Hell. Just beyond the 38th parallel, where the burning mountains are split by the salt flats of an ancient sea, hundreds of thousands of titanic spikes have been driven into the planetary crust. They jut outward from the cracked earth, black and jagged, their needlepoint tips rising as tall as modern skyscrapers. The spike field stretches endlessly into the distance, one after the other in rigid columns and rows. the precision of their placement undermined by the way some tilt and lean at uneasy angles. The spikes are clearly artificial, but of what material they've been formed remains unknown. Often they are described as ignoring or drinking in the light, and a distinct kind of silence exists across the whole of the field. There are striking similarities in the overall design of the spike field to long-term warning messages left on Earth after the Second Sinfaxi War. Critics claim these similarities may be introducing a bias into any analysis, but carved reliefs and sculptures are sometimes uncovered at the base of these spikes, reminiscent of those found in the boreholes, but with a meaning and tone that seems starkly opposed to anything else their civilization chose to immortalize. Many believe they depict expressions of agony, loss, and terror. Human physiology seems affected by the spike field, though symptoms across individuals are uneven. Some report weakness, bleeding, bruising, and sores. Entire groups have described disorienting visual disturbances, a phenomenon where the nearby stars in the well of embers appear to change positions overhead, or glide and weave like fireflies between the spikes. Nearly all reported a sense of being watched or taunted, with the stars always at the center of these feelings. When viewed from orbit, the spike field is indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. Even on clear days, the distant rows seem to melt away into the horizon. Despite this, extensive surveys have confirmed that it forms a perfect circle, composed of hundreds of thousands of spikes, spanning a diameter of 21.3 kilometers. At its exact center is a borehole. Unique among all those discovered, borehole 814 shows no sign of societal collapse or any inhabitation at any point in its history. It is the most well-preserved ruin on the planet, with only minimal fractures caused by centuries of tectonic shifts. The record of what was recovered within has been heavily redacted. Immediately upon discovery, the entire site was quarantined by the League of Nations Security Council. Over the course of 3 years, the site was stripped of anything noteworthy. A select few relics and artifacts have since rotated through some of the most prestigious museums, but access to detailed research and findings remains tightly controlled. The quarantine around borehole 814 and the surrounding spike field remains in effect, though is too undermanned to be strictly enforced. Sanctioned expeditions intermittently enter the area, but occasionally independent explorers, adventurers, and freelancers, skirting local patrols, have managed to enter and document both some of the field and the borehole itself. The inner structure of the latter is unlike any other on Kuralu, lacking a sprawling labyrinth and instead dominated by 9 immense chambers spanning hundreds of levels. 8 were emptied by the Security Council, while 1 remained sealed, apparently beyond even the efforts of the superpowers to open. The 8 accessible chambers were clearly ceremonial in nature. Intricate carvings and details cover every inch of exposed wall, ceiling, and floor, completely alien to human interpretation, yet nevertheless conveying a sense of weight and time. Enormous granite slabs filled with kuralu markings dominate much of each chamber, the only items too heavy and cumbersome to be removed, and thus left in place. It has been from these that the barest knowledge of their history has been painstakingly extracted. But the most common message, found everywhere in the spike field, is the most controversial. Translations have only been achieved through an unproven method, a xenolinguistic model that places equal weight on the surrounding architecture, symbolic context, and spatial alignment. It cannot provide a literal translation, but instead attempts to convey the core sentiment, re-expressed in a human context, through human terms and human phrases. The alien made familiar. It reads as follows. This place is a message. It is part of a series of messages. Pay attention. Sending this message was important to us. We considered ourselves to be a powerful culture. What is here was dangerous and repulsive to us. The danger is still present in your time as it was in ours. The danger is to the body. The danger will kill. This is not a place of honor. Nothing that can save you is here.